And good afternoon. My name is Barry Byrne. I'm a director consultant with PMI. I'm sure many of you will probably know me. And typically I work across many sectors and many different clients. So Susan and I did have a conversation around the title of this webinar. And I suppose it follows on one that I presented in March of this year. And at that particular point of time, of course, we were looking at the migration from co-located work to this home working from home, this virtual work scenario. And I think it's probably fair to say with the transition of time, we may actually be looking at a middle ground, a migration more towards a hybrid model. Something more about that later on. But it's probably fair to say that just now, we're still tending to live in a climate of uncertainty and volatility. And it's perhaps less so than before, but nonetheless, it's no surprise that we can find it all a little bit unsettling in our home and work life. And in preparing for this webinar, which is reviewing again the conversations I had in March of this year, I took out time to reflect on my own personal experience, PMI's experience, and clearly the clients that we've been working with over the last 18 months or so. So the journey that we've all had so far and where we are now. So what's happening to the world at work? What we once knew as bringing our people to work is now transforming to send the work to our people. However, that's been done by whatever means, by whatever approach. And in order to enable that transformation from bringing our people to work to send the work to our people, a different, and in some cases, a very different approach is required. Now, almost overnight from in and around March of 2020, our people were scattered to the four corners. You remind yourself of that time, those looking of grabbing whatever technology they could as they headed out of the office. And of course, obviously all of that technology was lawfully received. And they began setting up their temporary work base in any conceivable place. And Susan and I have seen everything. There's nothing that Susan and I have not seen. Let me be really honest with you. Of course, how that dispersion was managed at that particular time, how we enable that, perhaps is worth discussing, but maybe not today. So we planned, which might have been unlikely, or unintentionally fell into, which is the more likely, working from home, a combination of remote, isolated working coupled with our own personal anxieties. So, for example, my next Zoom call is really important, but it coincides with a man arriving to fix the washing machine. Or this a phrase that someone stopped the dog barking, I'm on the phone. And of course, a good number of us over this period of time actually become our own IT experts, bandwidth speeds being a talking point in the local pub. I think I maybe need to change my pub perhaps. But if ever there was a need for empathy, collaboration, and encouragement from our leaders and colleagues, never mind the techie stuff we had to encounter and overcome, to help those of us who struggled with the separation and the strangeness of it all, then this was it. Now, I don't have time to dig deep into every aspect of a successful virtual leader, but I will highlight some of the critical things to think about for someone who is open to reflect on their own practice and the possibility of enhancing that in some beneficial way. And I suppose the fact that you're sitting here listening to me may be suggesting that you're in that way. My first thought, though, the notion that leadership always comes naturally in an office setting where we can see our people, we can engage and monitor the performance, coach, share knowledge, create a positive vibe is, to some degree, for the birds. Add in the politics, the personalities, the poor or no direction, and you've got the reality for many of us. So now more than ever, leaders have to be on their A game in the new normal, almost certainly a hybrid working environment. Perhaps there are lessons from today's webinar that apply in any setting, whether it is virtual or hybrid or co-located. And of course, the journey from co-location to home working to moving back centrally into a hybrid model looks like it's the most likely future state. So we need to prepare for that. So today I'm going to describe the dynamic of virtual teams and share some of the useful practical techniques of communication and look at ways to build leadership and team competency in working virtually. Now, if we are talking teams, though, I think it's always useful for us to baseline ourselves, to align ourselves around the definition. What do we mean by a team? So if we can commit and agree that the definition that's on the screen, that it works for us and to which we aspire, then place this in the context of the challenges that we're going to be talking about, the ones that we face so far and undoubtedly will face going forward. Now, you might want to reflect on your own experiences of working with teams, both current and past, and consider how explicit we are or were in articulating and working to this definition. So what I'd like to do now, Suze, with your help, please, let's dust down a poll. So I'm interested in your experiences of transiting, not necessarily today's situation per se, although arguably many of us are still transiting to this new normal. We're still on that journey. So on the screen then you'll see a poll. What are your experiences of the transition? Answer 1, terrible, I still can't get into this. It's been okay, but I've had to do it all by myself. I have all that I need to do my job. Or it was planned to perfection. It was seamless.
Thanks, Barry. That poll is launched. And for anyone who's joining us on a live stream, do put your comments, your answers to these questions into the comments, and we'll pick them up and add them in to the final votes, as it were. I think an interesting range there, Barry, and I think it's obviously, things have changed for people, but my goodness, what a range we've experienced when we've talked to clients.
Absolutely, we have, and I suppose perhaps that was an element of this unpredictability. How long might this go on for? And as a consequence, therefore, how much planning, how much thought do we need to put into this? So in some respects, being caught out by it may well be maybe just an appreciation of the breadth and depth of the challenge that we face globally. As we've moved on 18 months now, of course, we're in a whole new scenario.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And we've got more to say. I'm looking forward to what more you have to say about that, because it definitely has been changing, hasn't it, over time, and the expectations, particularly as you mentioned earlier with hybrid working, very different for people. So last couple of seconds, and if you haven't yet selected the option that you think best represents how you feel, if you'd like to do so now, and then I'll close the poll and share it with everybody. Okay. So everyone should now be able to see those results. And I'm just going to read them out because those people who are on live stream won't be able to see these answers. So going from answer 1, terrible, I still can't get into it, 8% have voted for that. Answer 2, 42%, it's been okay, but I've had to do it all by myself. And 50%, I have all that I need to do my job. We don't have any votes for answer 4. It was planned to perfection and seamless.
Okay, which may actually, in some ways, support our theories relating to what we've experienced in many cases.
Yes.
And we do describe mothers, in adversity, how creative we can be, and we've seen all sorts of creative solutions.
Indeed.
So perhaps someone at other time to look at, I have all I need to do my job, may well have been a function of how self-sufficient we've become.
Yes, yes. And of course, we know, don't we, a percentage of people have worked virtually for some time, be that home workers or be that on different sites, different continents, etc.
Absolutely, and I'm going to be challenging that and laying that out for us to look at, particularly in the context of leadership. Okay, so thank you for that. So as we would typically do, it's always important to define and maybe compare and contrast some common expressions, virtual teams versus traditional teams being a case in point. The virtual team working, or a hybrid, is the new reality for this century. There's no question. The nature of the work has changed dramatically for many, and it's a much more complex work environment that we're in. And perhaps there are more interactions, and probably more often with what I'm hearing more and more, unknown people. You know, there are people appearing on our landscape, in our territory, for whom we actually have no physical connection with. You know, new starts into organization is now starting to ramp up in terms of the proportion of people coming into work today. So these clearly raise some additional challenges. But how do we make that work seamless? How do we make this complexity that we're now finding ourselves in? How do we make it work? How do we collaborate across time, space, and technology? How do we maintain a connected and engaged workforce working in a rapidly transforming and complex work environment so that productivity is maintained? Because that's fundamentally, in essence, the purpose of our attending work, but social implications and all as that might be. So it's as true today as it was 18 months ago. Then many organizations, or most organizations, had teams that were often highly distributed across large open plan offices on different floors, buildings, estates, territories. And I think that perhaps we might need to reflect on that. So many of the organizations we worked in were very distributed. So then collaboration didn't come naturally or easily. So it's fair to suggest that it may not become any easier now. So what's the leader's role in all of this? And that's the purpose of today's webinar. I guess in the initial stages and at the key points, someone has to define the reality, the current situation, to clarify the context we're working in, the landscape within which the team operates. Someone has to have that galvanizing influence. In other words, the glue that keeps all of our disparate work together. So, but do we do that? Does someone provide that galvanizing, that context, the landscape? Did we do that as part of the mobilization of working from home 18 months ago? And I think there's a big question mark about that. And if we didn't, are we seeing, and now are we beginning to have to deal with the consequences? So not having prepared us for the initial tranches of working from home and not necessarily coming to grips with that, 18 months in, are we now dealing with a situation that in some cases is becoming a norm? So the global pandemic has forced us all to take stock and adapt, and to do so with lightning speed in many cases, and arguably on our own. And I think perhaps the poll might be suggesting that the reality may well have been that we had to work it out for ourselves. And all of this with no interruption to business. We've all had to learn at an incredible pace. And some of us, some of the older and more senior of us, had additional burdens added into the complexities that we're facing. So as a consultant operating in a physical world, to consult with this big cloud in the middle, this big hurdle called technology, brought its own challenges and anxieties. So we've had to learn quickly, we've had to adapt, but we've also needed to reflect and learn, and it's never been greater. Certainly if we need to move from the current, maybe the current cultural norm that we're establishing into something that is more effective and efficient. So, and we're looking at both as an individual and interdependently. And perhaps as an individual, we're looking to manage how we work today in the virtual world, but also we need to consider how interdependent are we and how well is that working? Now, I did some work about 10 years ago when I worked closely with a client who had anxieties, had concerns that their global auditing team, which was essentially 7 senior executives working around the globe, very different timescales, very different culture, from east to west. And the general consensus in that team was that it didn't work particularly well as a virtual team. And hence they asked me to work with them in order to understand the dynamics, some psychology behind working as virtual teams, and also some of the principles in practice that they might wish to adopt. So in the course of the work with this particular client, I came across work by Tom Allen. And this dates to 1977. And that's significantly earlier than COVID and the onset of virtual work. So I was able to use this perhaps as a reassurance that the team, frankly, really shouldn't have been too despondent, as their experiences may not have been quite so unique. And I think for what they were discovering then, on the basis of this 50-foot rule, I mean, who ever heard of the 50-foot rule? They actually did quite a good job. In fact, I would suggest that they did a very good job of collaborating, sharing knowledge, and learning. Now, the reality, of course, that Tom Allen was bringing forward is that based on proximity, the people are not likely to collaborate, certainly not as a matter of course, not very often, if they are more than 50 feet apart. And as you can see on this scale, you know, he's using this 50-foot rule. And I suppose if I reflected on my own experience, that probably is quite true. You know, this sort of situation, even when we're co-located, and the sense that the issue about how well we collaborated across the same floor or above to the next floor or beneath was the one, frankly, that we never really looked to resolve. So it is conceivable that we already have issues with leading in the real world, let alone in the virtual one. And perhaps collaboration doesn't come naturally or not particularly easily. And I suppose maybe you need to consider that for a few moments to reflect on your own experiences and sharing your thoughts with Suze in the chat function. So let's look at the dynamics then of virtual teams. And they're typically four elements, four dimensions to these virtual teams themselves. So the model itself, which is work from Lipnack and Stamps in 2008, and again, significantly predates COVID and virtual working. And the four elements are purpose, people, links, and time. So in virtual teams, people are linked through a common purpose over a prolonged time frame. Typically, that's what we're looking to establish. And of course, in co-located teams, we're looking to do the same, but I'm specifically referring then to virtual teams. The success, the failures, and the challenges of any virtual team come from interaction, essentially around these four dimensions. So let's look at them in turn. The purpose. It links with our team definition you saw before, and it acts as the binding force. Remember this galvanizing, this glue that keeps us together. It guides us in what we do every day, either independently or interdependently. So first is the purpose. Of course, the second element are the people. And virtual teams are more than just technology, although occasionally we seem to get hung up in the beauty of the technology itself. And for those who are not particularly techie savvy, that can necessarily and may actually exclude. So it is about how members of the virtual team relate to both the internal as well as the external environment. So how we relate to each other within that community and how our community relates to others. So we need to work internally, clearly, and we also need to work externally in coordination with other teams. And I think this can often be overlooked. So the challenges of me being a person in a virtual team often dominates when we may actually neglect this view that says within our internal team, how well do we interface with other teams? Now, a productive virtual team needs to integrate at both internal and external levels, and ideally sharing the state of leadership, not the role of leadership, but the state of leadership when and where appropriate. Now, the third element of interest in this model is the links. And of course, we are linked through multimedia tools. because they're reducing the boundaries between all of us. It's facilitating work processes and to help decision making. Typically, that's essentially what we're looking to do. So because of the absence of our physical interactions, where we've got multimedia, it is required to help us build those relationships. And specifically, and here is perhaps the heart of the issue, is developing trust among the virtual team members and forming bonds so that we all perform efficiently and effectively. So trust is a critical success factor for any virtual team. And as you'll see, the leader has a specific role to play in that. And then the last element, of course, is the one element that is secret, is time. Matching each member's work calendar needs collaboration. And I'm hearing more and more about, diaries and diary manipulation and some different ways of operating, different modus operandi in terms of how diaries have been used, and in some cases, how they've been tampered with. We need collaboration in order to schedule meetings and discussions for tracking projects, as a case in point. So it's really important, therefore, that rather than making an assumptions about how we work, it's important to set ground rules at the formative stages, so avoiding ambiguity and conflict at a later stage. So people's interactions across boundaries, both in the team and externally to the team, require behaviors that are often new to us. Now, if collaboration is one of the hallmarks of an effective, efficient, and agile teams, what are the barriers to collaboration? Now, one of them is that people can feel victims of the system. Fear, working independently without necessary reference, leads to a risk avoidance and often this self-protection, which is understandable. Knowledge is power, and it can be used to maintain the status in this new world. Relationship building may not necessarily be encouraged or valued. It just does not seem to be important that we build relationships within our internal teams, let alone external teams. Independent action is rewarded, often without recognition of the wider contribution of others. So that informal, ad hoc contact we have in a co-located, in a physical world, often has been replaced by independent action, so single point data relating to action of an individual, rather than necessarily recognizing the contribution of the wider team. Now, we will come back to this again, but I would like to propose that the challenge we have as an individual is to grapple with the inevitable and the ongoing tension between me being different, which of course is one of our key drivers. So in other words, enhancing our individuality, me as a person, and being fulfilled as a person. And also at the same time, the need to bond, to integrate, to bond within the groups. So I'd just like to understand a little bit more then about our thinking, and specifically thinking of working in the new normal. And I'm curious about our feelings. So how would you describe your feelings just now? It's the most isolated I have ever felt in work. It's not perfect, but I'm working through it myself. I'm getting the one-to-one support to help me, or I feel connected and engaged with the core business and colleagues. Thanks, Suze.
That's okay, that's launched. I mean, I think this is, it's a great question, Barry, isn't it? Because I don't know about what you've seen, but I've been talking to people where some of the habits, the regularity of how they met with others, with pre-pandemic, that were just absolutely regular. It's what they did every week or every month and so on. Those stopped for good reason, and in some cases haven't been restarted or replaced. And I think that's an interesting, it's quite quick. We all know it's quite quick to get out of a habit, isn't it? And sometimes it takes us longer to realize that that's what we've done.
Yeah, and I think what we need to do as well, Suze, is perhaps pay more attention to the joy that we got in physical work when we were together. Yeah. And it's recognizing that actually in the physical environment, we had both organizational relationships and social relationships.
Yes.
And social relationships were also were also perhaps a significant contributor to the glue that kept our work together.
Yes.
And I have a sense, and perhaps the survey will tell me differently, I have a sense that we've tended to assume that the physical hour and the virtual hour are the same, if you get my meaning. That hour in essence may very well have been made up by social interaction that was motivating in its own right, that was stimulating in its own right. And of course that now in many cases isn't available to us. And therein lies the danger.
Indeed, indeed. So thank you everybody for answering the questions. That's great. I'm sharing them now for everyone who's on the webinar with us, just to go through the answers for those who are on the live streams. So question 1, it's the most isolated I've ever felt in work. 25% have agreed with that. It's not perfect, but I'm working my way through it myself. 17%. I'm getting the one-to-one support to help me. 8%. I feel connected and engaged with the core business and colleagues. 50%.
Well, I'm going to be honest. I'm really reassured by the 50% who feel connected and engaged. Yeah. I'm really inspired and enthused by that. My theory was it would not be as high as that, but I'm really inspired that that's the case. Yes. By the same token, the 40% who feel that they're not engaged, it's not perfect, or it's the most isolated, clearly would be a concern, which may actually be highlighting that the current norm perhaps should not be our final resting position.
Yes, I think.
Hence the concept of virtual working. That's my new theory. If I could be allowed to say that, Suze.
Yeah,
so it is like any other change, and of course, without over-egging this, often change can be an experience almost of grieving. And whilst I wouldn't go so far as to suggest that that's what some of my personal and client-facing engagements might have felt like, sometimes it felt that the emotional impact of change, how we respond to change and handle that transition, is critical to success of any change or initiative. Now, as I'm exposing these, I think it's important that we're not just considering the people who are within the team, those individuals, those personalities. I think it's really important that we position this clearly, that the leader themselves is not just operating in terms of how they inspire and motivate their teams, but how do they cope with these elements? They should consider themselves as well as their people, because it is a lifelong ambition to be able to do this well. The reality for a leader can be equally as emotional, and why would it not, with the added challenge of how I continue to inspire and motivate my people. So I'm hoping to be able to at least give some guidance and direction in terms of how we can cope with that specific change. So if we recognize the emotional impact of change in general, irrespective of what it is, and I think these are part of as you can see here, these are probably some examples. We need an approach that takes the emotional impact into consideration. What is that model? What is that approach? Well, for those who know PMI well enough, many of you who will have worked with us will recognize Jack Gibb and Jack Gibb's work, also known as the hamburger model. Now, as you will recall, this model perfectly illustrates the challenge any leader faces, whether that's virtual, hybrid, or otherwise. in enabling his or her people to develop intrinsic motivation. It's within themselves for them to be effective in their work. Now, we know changes in an external event, you know, that we have children, we move to a new home, you get a new manager. But transformation is actually an internal event within me. So I have a child, but I learn to be a parent. We move to a new town, I learn to become part of the community. I get a new manager, and God knows how traumatic that can be. You align and settle into the new regime. So how leaders respond to the change and handle the transition is therefore critical to success or otherwise, or the success of change or any initiative. And as you can see, what we're looking to accomplish is an agile and collaborative virtual working environment. Now, so on the three elements of the GIB model, if we look at task first, and that's the real work of the system, process or project, and that's to enable it to deliver its purpose to the customer. So what do we need to do? Then we've got the task process, the set of processes and protocols that guide us and guide the way we work. It's also our capability to tackle similar challenges in the future. And then finally, what we call the social, emotional, political realities, the feelings people bring with them as a result of their reaction often to previous experiences. You know, how we feel is often unspoken about the work they do, how they feel sometimes unspoken about the current improvement process and their motivation to complete it, how they feel often unspoken about each other, how we feel often unspoken about you as a leader. And it feels that these elements may also not necessarily have the due diligence, the focus and governance that perhaps they should. Now, I would characterize, therefore, the approach in two ways. Suze, okay?
Sorry, Barry. So this is related actually to the going back to the poll
Yes.
earlier. So Stefan has asked, you know, if that sample of data that we had from that poll is representative of the population, where basically 50% feel fully connected and in sync with their colleagues, and the other 50% are not in that same place, then, you know, we need to understand what impact that's having on organizational performance,
Absolutely.
both productively and perhaps more important from a qualitative perspective.
Correct.
And Stefan said, you know, what are your thoughts on that?
Indeed, and I think I sort of compared and contrasted the 50 and the 50 in a similar sort of vein, and I suppose if I was to put it back into the pre-COVID era and seek to understand how typically we managed that sort of data previously. So is 50%, and we're recognizing it's a small sample, so consequently we can just go with the data we have. Has it always been our practice to understand in whatever world, virtually or otherwise, how motivated, engaged, and connected our people felt anyway? And is this a new phenomenon? So I think the danger is that we could classify this as a phenomenon that has arisen in the last 18 months. And I would caution us to understand, have we always had challenges in terms of engagement and commitment and understanding?
Yeah.
And therefore, fundamentally, it's asking us about the quality of leadership before we went into COVID. I mean, bluntly, could we say hand on heart that it was everything that it needed to be? And therein lies the challenge. So we need to go upstream, and we're talking cause and effect here. Yeah, and I think that's right. But nonetheless, it's an extremely important point. You know, to understand, discover, understand, and then theorize as to how best we can move forward.
Indeed. Thank
now,
you. And thank you.
In terms of the GIB model itself, there are two elements, and these are the two core elements of leadership in terms of how do we enable, therefore, this trust and essentially this effective and efficient and productive team. The transactional approach, of course, is the upper level of the GIB model, and a key focus of a leader is the execution of the task, the doing, and the achievement of the team objectives to the defined timeline. We can see that they are transactional, whereas the transformational elements, which of course is the key in order to deliver that agile and collaborative virtual working environment. The leader should use different mechanisms, and often newer mechanisms to those that we've recognized before, both to motivate and inspire the team members. And it is about these things, about caring, nurturing, and the intellectual support that's required. So again, you know, where we are ticking these boxes, the likelihood is we'll get an extremely healthy and constructive output. So the leader is expected to foster the team identity. So what is this team for? What's the purpose of it? To build trust, help people build relationships amongst themselves, and these strong social ties you talked about before, Suze, and encouraging of collaboration and cohesion. And of course, the other art of good leadership is being able to apply both of those in situational terms. So being able to adapt the appropriate, and there are only two, in the most appropriate way for the situation. So therefore, I think this is the slide then that's going to determine essentially, these are the two characteristics. And as a consequence, let's build on this a little bit more. So the overarching leadership approach, it's an amalgam of the two key components we talked about before. Now, I think from where I'm sitting, and as I consult the clients, you know, often a model like this would probably serve us well to begin to define what we mean by leader and what we mean by manager, because that, I'm sure your experience is similar, Suze. These are very, very useful discussions that we have. What's the difference between a leader and a manager? Because it's not a distinction we necessarily have consensus on in terms of its meaning. And perhaps this is the first time it's presented in this way. And remember, we're lifting it essentially from the topic I introduced just before, which is the GIB model. Now, so the two contrasting styles, transformational, in other words, empowerment, you know, tapping into the deeper needs and motivations of our people. So there's something about knowing these people who are working in this virtual world. And at the same time, the transactional things, you know, the conventional management as we would see it, in which risk and reward functions as key motivators. Often that's the case. Now, I'd be more than happy at another point to go through the transactional elements, you know, the techie stuff and all of those sort of key motivators in physical terms. But I'm going to spend the limited time I have to focus on the central core accountabilities of our leaders. And that's in enabling us to transition the pathway from this old way of working, and some of us still mourn for that, into this new normal. And as we said, this new normal may actually be in a hybrid model. So I'm looking at the left-hand side of the model itself. So a virtual team leader should have high levels of technical, social, emotional capabilities, and should be able to strike a balance between the two styles. Now, it's a life's work. Let's be clear about this. But creating a distinctive approach, because this is now the long term, to manage often multicultural, multi-language, multilingual, multi-geography, territory, and often multi-time zone teams. So virtual workers typically relate well, and why wouldn't they, to transformational leaders who are demonstrating all that? Because the change in the approach responds well to the new dynamic. So that's about this empowering, tapping into the different needs and motivations of our people. But for this to work, we need to recognize that trust is the foundation. Trust is the foundation of effective leadership and teamwork. And actually, we need to feel it before we begin to build those relationships, before we begin to communicate and exchange information freely. I think that's a statement of reality. Like other helping relations, collaboration, working together, cannot truly be effective until a relationship of trust is created. Now, interestingly, the word trust in Middle English actually is a reference to confidence, and it's having confidence in the integrity the ability and the good character of someone else. And in this case, it's the leader. It doesn't come easily in the virtual world. It didn't come easy in the co-located world. And that's often because we've limited opportunity in this newer world for face-to-face communication and for this same space interactions we had before. So whilst the environment in co-located had the opportunities for that, maybe the question is, did we ever realize them? Leaders need to make more time to catch up with team members and get to know them as people. So we need to create opportunities, and we need to do that proactively. So some of the things, and developing the team competency in virtual working, some of the things I found particularly useful in my practice, so in practical terms, and that I'd just like to share with you briefly. So we also know it's not about just about what was said. It's also about the spoken word, the body language, and the tone of voice. Now, I think all of this is now pretty obvious to most of us as we're operating, that it isn't just a spoken word, of course, that carries the weight. And if only 7% of what we communicated is by actual words spoken, we know what makes up the other 2 now. But therein lies part of the challenge. Our words themselves in the virtual world and in the real world could be completely innocent, but the way in which they're delivered may mean that they take on a whole different meaning. Susan.
So I was reminded of a meeting I had this morning, which was on Teams, which is with an existing client of ours in terms of the corporation, but the individual I met with was the first time I'd met with them. Our habit now is that when we join a Teams meeting, we turn our camera on. And of course, that was never our habit before the pandemic, actually. Not, you know, it just wasn't normal.
No.
And this particular person I met with didn't turn their camera on. I was a bit surprised because that's so standard, not just internally, but externally as well with other people we meet with. And eventually I thought, gosh, I need to ask. So I said to them, would you be comfortable turning your camera on? You know, as we haven't met before, it'd be nice to put a face to the name. And they said, no, I don't turn my camera on. And I thought, gosh, and actually I remembered that other people in the organization had said that cameras weren't in full use, not everyone did. And it really took me back to pre-COVID, how all of my conference calls were done with cameras off. But what I had was the added advantage of having met those people, usually face-to-face, on-site somewhere. And I struggled with that meeting this morning because I struggled when they said things. I wasn't sure whether they were serious or joking. You know, I was missing all of that body language.
Absolutely.
I couldn't see if there was funny, and I was hesitating to laugh at things I thought were funny. And of course they may not. And that I found that very difficult, particularly as it was the first time I met them. And I wanted to share with you also, Hamdi in the Q&A had put in a question, which is, you know, what about the effect of virtual teams if we consider the great variance in the types of jobs that people do, you know, from technical to field jobs, people who are doing online sales jobs. You know, there's an enormous way of how we handle these tasks today that has progressed so much more. I have new clients that PMI have started working with over the last 18 months that I have never met face to face, and I know exactly what they look like because of the camera. I've built a really good relationship with them. I don't know if I ever will meet them now. You know, I don't think they want to, you know, get on a plane and fly here, and we'd need to justify that time and money and effort for all of us to do that. So things have changed hugely in our expectations of how we will work now in this era, I think.
Indeed, and of course the challenge there therefore is what assumptions might we make because we don't have the full picture.
Yes.
And therefore what action does this drive or doesn't drive, as the case might be. So I think in terms of beginning to respond to that, the key focus has to be about staying on the same page. And by what means might we do that? Well, there's something about, you know, these regular one-to-one check-ins. And I suppose as I'm going through this list, and there are just 4 items relating to that, but how often, how normal is this our practice? or do we just not have time for these things? So the regular one-on-one check-ins to talk about any obstacles or concerns they were facing. Now, they may well have been done at the coffee machine in the past, but they're certainly in many cases not being done today. You know, be open and understanding of what our remote workers have to say, and offer any advice or support that you can. As a leader, be open and those lines of communication available. By building trust with your remote workforce, easier said than done, you know, you strengthen the communication and make them feel valued. And then finally, this thing about creating an honest and open work environment, it not only motivates our teams, but also will help in collaboration across the teams. So this honest and open, and again, subject to definition, subject to comprehension and understanding about what we mean by that and how that would be deployed in its reality. Now, I've no wish to move through this slide in its entirety, but I think it's important that perhaps we just understand or at least realize this little bit. And even I had to be coached and understand what is listening. And it may have been a while ago, but still it's important. It's important to define what exactly is listening. Well, listening is when a person decides that they will take their attention off their own concerns, thoughts, feelings, and suggestions, and concentrate on listening to the other person. I mean, how good would that be? How difficult would it be? So if we consider our own experiences, what's our default? Is it situational or is it person specific? Why do we think this is? And what changes do we need to begin to look at making in order to be able to do that? So listen now for information about the task, the process, and the social and emotional political aspects. In other words, make use of the GIB model, use the lenses of the GIB model in order to be able to address this. Now, collaboration, and I referred to this before, but if collaboration is one of the hallmarks of an effective, efficient, and agile team, what are the barriers? And we talked about this. But what is important? What are the conditions for collaboration? Well, if we feel victims of the system, clearly relationships are important and they are key to providing knowledge and support networks. So being an island in its own right, and I appreciate the point that was made before, Suze, which is really powerful. What if I am in a specialist role? How does that play out? Feel comfortable in taking risks, because sadly, in the virtual world, fear leads to risk avoidance and self-protection. In other words, potentially, there may be, in the virtual world, this risk averse. So we avoid risk because of the fear, because actually we're more exposed should it go wrong. Create the opportunity for formal and informal conversation where new ideas are shared and old assumptions can be challenged. And it comes back to this thing about knowledge being power and can be used to maintain the status quo. And finally, learning takes place as much as when we get it wrong and as we get it right. And of course, this is a concept of PDSA. Relationship building should be encouraged and valued. Independent action is rewarded without recognition of the wider contribution. So essentially, therefore, we're taking learning for what it's worth, and we're also taking the learning where we found that it doesn't work as much as it has. So really, I suppose at some point we need to be transactional in terms of contracting. So having said everything that we've said so far, there is a point in our engagement where contracting is the process where we agree with others how we'll work together to achieve the objective. It is a psychological as well as a social agreement, but it's actually making explicit our understanding and the collaborative arrangements that we should have regarding how we agree to work. Now, how often do we contract with each other? How explicit are we in those engagements? Could we share them with someone new to the team? Are they operationally defined? Are they written down? And I have to say that sadly they're missing in many cases. They might claim, it might be claimed they are implicit, but if we check in with the team, we probably find we have an entirely different understanding. So rarely seen, and I often wonder at this, whether this extends to the fundamental enabling processes like communication. So My suggestions, therefore: 1, practice the new behaviors in meetings, scheduled or unscheduled, from today. Reflection, look back at the learning and keep a note of the things. This might sound like very mechanistic, but actually it's important to understand the journey we're on and the progress we're making. Clarify, begin all of our meetings, whether they're scheduled or unscheduled, by having an understanding and clarifying the purpose. What are we trying to accomplish? And you can see the 3-question model here. Check in at the end of the meeting. How did we do? Did it meet our needs? What can we do better? How can we make this even better? Listen and check in to understand how we really heard. And finally, inquire. Ask interesting questions, not just those that will help you to make a judgment or a statement. You know, questions that get the other person to think is good coaching. So, in summary, in order to achieve the highest performing, most efficient, effective, and agile virtual team, it is a lifetime's work. It's something that we constantly need to pay care and attention to. If we set out with the principle, the method, and the tools, which is the 3 things we've been describing today, and above all, maintain constancy of purpose. In other words, stick at it, because we may not get it right. We may fall off our horse, but allow us that opportunity to be inelegant, because we can learn from that. Working virtually doesn't have to, or maybe never will, replicate what we had before COVID. In summary, therefore, the characteristics or the traits of a good virtual leader will be those who have empathy, fairness, their communication and listening skills are of a high order. They are authentic. And also, typically, they're good decision makers based on the data that they have. They typically inspire and motivate their people, and their people see them to be those. They will set clear visions. They do bring people together, and they go out of their way to know their people as people. So, achieving and sustaining an agile, collaborative, and ultimately successful virtual working team absolutely demands both transformational and transactional leadership, leading and managing. The 5 points I show you on the slide: engage, listen, contract, collaborate, check in, are a useful baseline from which to start. Good luck on your journey.
Barry, thank you so much. I really, I think this is a fascinating topic. I think there's more to be said on it, more to learn about it. And but thank you very much for your insights today. I particularly like your final 5. I shall pin those up. Everyone, you can see the details of our upcoming schedule of webinars. As I mentioned some of them at the beginning of today's session. So please do go to our website, pmi.co.uk/webinars, and you can register there. And those of you that have registered and joined us today, thank you very much. Look out for our Voice the Customer survey. Please do share your feedback on other topics you'd also like us to cover. We look forward to seeing you next week, next time, next month. Thank you, everybody. Do have a great weekend.